Right, hello and welcome to the second of our Cromwell Art Lectures. So these are specific lectures that we're putting in place, little webinars, talking about different aspects of the museum's art collection and how they tell us things about the Cromwell family and life in the mid-17th century. This afternoon I am delighted to be joined by our friends and historian and author Miranda Malins. Miranda has written two brilliant historical novels about the sort of Cromwell family, and most particularly focusing on two of Cromwell's daughters. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Miranda.
Thank you for having me, it's lovely to be here.
And welcome to the Cromwell Museum, and thank you very much for giving us a bit of time today to talk about these remarkable women. What we're going to do over about the next 25 minutes or so is talk through some of the portraits in the museum's collections here that are basically relating to some of the women of the Cromwell family. Which is not an aspect that necessarily many people perhaps consider. People think of Cromwell as the great statesman, as the great soldier. People think of him as a controversial character for many, and yet not many people think about the women in his life, do they?
No, they don't. He's a very masculine, martial figure in popular imagination, isn't he? And we think of this whole period actually as very masculine, very military, lots of battles, and now, battle reenactments. But actually, Cromwell lived his life surrounded by women and had very close relationships with all of them, and they are vital to his worldview and to his life.
He grows up in a very female-dominated household, doesn't he? So he's got, obviously his father dies quite young, he's only sort of 17, 18 years of age, and he grows up basically with his mother and 6 sisters. So he's very sort of surrounded by women and very comfortable with women, I think.
He is, I think that's absolutely right. And his father's premature death summons him back from university from Cambridge early, and he takes on the mantle of this household, being the only man with a widowed mother and, as you say, many, many sisters. And then he goes on to, marry, we're going to talk about this, and have his own daughters. And his household always includes sisters, spinster sisters, his widowed mother, for the rest of her life. And so he is surrounded by women and very, very comfortable in female company. We know from his letters, from his later life, he really cultivates female friendships and writes some of his most intimate and revealing letters actually to his female friends and relations. So, and then women go on to be at the centre of the court when he becomes Lord Protector. So the women here are at the heart of this story. They should not be in the margins.
Oh, absolutely the case. And it's actually quite a privilege to be showing you this, because actually this is the first time this has been on camera. Literally just arrived in the museum in the last couple of days. This is a new acquisition, a long-term loan to us from a private collector. And this is, we think, and we say think, there's a bit of a qualifier on this, that this may well be a portrait of Oliver Cromwell's mother, Elizabeth Cromwell, Elizabeth Stuart, as she originally was. There has never been a positively identified portrait of Cromwell's mum. There's one potentially in the collection of Chequers, the Prime Minister's residence, which actually has quite a large collection of artefacts relating to the Cromwell family, which has never been 100% identified. This particular painting, a gentleman got in touch with us last year, having seen one of our trustees at a lecture, and actually had this in his attic. He bought it some years ago at auction. We know that this particular painting belonged to the collection of the Earls of Sandwich, a family very closely associated with the Cromwell family, who lived at Hinchinbrook House on the outskirts of Huntingdon, a property that was originally bought by the Cromwells. So in terms of the provenance, it's a really interesting painting. It's quite obviously got a very close connection to them. And Miranda, we were just looking earlier on at some of the other paintings, the painting of her brother, just the other side, and the physiognomy is very similar, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? I mean, it's quite exciting to see this, very exciting to see this in flesh. And she does definitely have some Cromwellian features, does she not? The sort of slightly hooded eyes, the long nose. You were pointing out that the nose is very similar to that of her brother's in his portrait. So, as you say, we can't say definitively that this is her, but, it's looking good.
It is, yeah. So it's an interesting one, and we'll continue to research on that. And obviously, if you've got the opportunity to come and see this painting, it's now on display for the very first time. How much do we know about Cromwell's parents? I mean, we do not a huge amount, do we, really?
No, not a huge amount, not really. We know obviously about that Cromwell is the son of Robert, Cromwell, who himself is the second son of, you know, I guess the preeminent, going back a few generations, local family, and the owners, as you say, of Hinchinbrook House. But you know, they fall on rather harder times during Oliver's childhood, and Hinchinbrook is sold, as you say, to the Montague family, and the Cromwells move. You know, the Cromwells live here in Huntingdon, and yes, so Oliver's parents really, you know, we don't know a great deal about them. There were legends that Oliver's mother, her name Stuart, actually meant that she was related to the Stuart royal family from the Scottish kings. When Oliver became head of state and everyone was casting around to try and find wonderful myths to legitimise his rule, that was one of the ones that was plucked out of the ether. Yes, I also always make a silly point about how everyone in Cromwell's family is always called Elizabeth. Their mother's called Elizabeth, his wife's called Elizabeth, his daughter's called Elizabeth. So,
well, it's very common in the 17th century, isn't it? It's family names are both Christian names and surnames, aren't they? It is,
exactly, and this is clearly a Cromwell family name. But this is just such a beautiful portrait, isn't it?
It's also very elaborate as well, and it kind of, we assume, I mean, we were discussing this earlier, we think this painting probably again dates the late 1640s, early 1650s, which is when many of the portraits of Cromwell sort of date from. And, you know, again, it gives the sort of the lie to the image of the sort of dour Puritan again, doesn't it? With the sort of elaborate clothing. You know, there's a good bit of status going on here with the jewellery and the silk and so on.
Absolutely. I mean, look at this beautiful blue colour and this sort of swirls of fabric. And, you know, you might not be able to see it at that distance, but there's this beautiful, intricate kind of gold and silver lace going on here. And even her cap, which you think of as being quite a modest garment, look how it's shiny and it's sort of made of silk or satin or something. So again, we're a far cry from your Mayflower Puritans with the big broad hats, black and the white collars, and ladies who were to be seen and not heard. I think a lady dressed like that would very much have been heard as well as seen.
Yeah, so there's some lovely jewellery going on, as well as the string of pearls, which we'll see in at least one of the painting. And there's also this rather nice little piece of jewellery that's got a clasp at the front there. And one of the things we'll be looking at as we do further research into this painting is whether or not we can find any household accounts, any records of that quite distinctive piece of jewellery there, these sort of three little squares together with emeralds of them, because obviously that would give further evidence that this painting is who we think it might be. So it's a really interesting painting, this one. Do we know how much of an influence, I mean, Cromwell must have obviously had, arguably in one sense, she was the woman who was most present in his life. I mean, arguably, you know, much longer than even Elizabeth, his wife, in a way.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you think that Cromwell, when Oliver returns after his father's death, and you know, starts living with his mother as the man running the household, I imagine they would have run their affairs very much as a sort of couple, really, because she would have run the domestic affairs. Yeah, and then he brings back his own wife, Elizabeth, and they all have to coexist, wife, mother-in-law, and Oliver. But Oliver's mother lives with him throughout the rest of her life. She moves with him into all his different houses and lodgings, and eventually ends up living in the palaces of Whitehall and Hampton Court with her son when he becomes Lord Protector. And she's with him there for the first year or so of his rule until she dies, and is amazingly given this elaborate funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey. So, you know, she really is treated like the mother of the king. And they must have been very close to have rubbed shoulders so amicably for all those decades and with all those other people in the house. It's a remarkable mother and son relationship, I think.
I was going to say, we can only speculate about the nature of the relationship between the different family members, and of course you found a very creative way of doing that, obviously, through your novels. Okay, so we've got here the second of our paintings, which of course is probably the most important woman in Cromwell's life, who of course is his wife Elizabeth. And we've got two portraits of Elizabeth in our collection. One that dates from the late 1700s that wasn't really from life, but depicts her as a much younger woman, obviously as his wife and mother as it were. This one here that dates from the 1650s is the kind of Lady Protectress. There's a lovely painting of her here by Robert Walker, and probably dates from the period, well, as I say, where Cromwell was head of state, so it's obviously emphasising that particular sense of power to it. It's a lovely painting, isn't it?
It's gorgeous. It's so lovely. And again, at a distance, you see the black, don't you? And you think, oh, maybe it's a bit austere, but it really isn't. And you often say this, Stuart, that black at the time was actually very expensive, and the fabric she's wearing is very rich, and with this lovely kind of burnished russet gold sort of wrap, sleeves around her, and the elaborate pearls, the double drop pearl earrings, the pearl necklace, the cameo at her chest, which I'm sure you'll mention.
Yes, the cameo, of course, which actually is really interesting because it actually may well be a cameo that we've actually got in the museum's collections. It's lovely to have actually, not only, well, it shows the richness of this collection, and many of the items are on display from the Cromwell family's descendants, the Bush family. And these are items that have been passed down over generations. And there is a small cameo that we've got in the museum's collections surrounded by rubies, which has been suggested recently may actually be the one that appears in this particular portrait. We can't prove that for certain because it's a little indistinct in the picture, but it's lovely to think that that's the case, that there's a few kind of real connection.
It is, isn't it? And also, I mean, you can really see here, I think, the evolution from sort of wife and mother of an ordinary household in the Fens through now to effectively queen. I mean, Elizabeth lived as effectively a queen in the royal palaces and hosted dignitaries and foreign ambassadors at her own table, presided over events, and I think it's captured very well here. I don't think she looks like mutton dressed as lamb or whatever various people criticised her at the time for, didn't they, for sort of not accepting her own humble origins and dressing above herself and getting above herself. But I think here this is a lovely blend because she looks modest and puritanical and sensible and devoted, but also richly dressed and looks approachable as well, I think too. Stately but approachable.
She's a fascinating character though, isn't she? I mean, we know she's the daughter, we don't know very much about her early life. We know she's the daughter of Sir James Bourchier. He was a London fur dealer and property owner. We don't really know the circumstances of how she and Oliver met. It may well have been an arranged marriage, but we don't know for sure. We just know that they get married in 1620. But whatever, they develop this really close relationship, a very devoted relationship from their surviving letters, don't they?
Very devoted relationship. And a relationship that is put under enormous strain with first sort of economic crisis and deep depression, which Oliver suffers in the 1630s. And the family are reduced to the status of tenant farmers in nearby St Ives. And then obviously she has to live through the years of war, where her husband's away fighting and she's running things at home, all the way through all the political wranglings that happen after that, the king's execution, and then finds herself thrust into the limelight and often, very cruelly attacked in public, in the press, and by opponents of the regime, as effectively a de facto queen. So the fact that she and Oliver, from what we can tell in the sources, and we have no reason not to believe that, had a very close relationship and a close marriage.
This wonderful quote, my life is but half a life in your absence.
Exactly.
So it's like out of a Valentine's Day card.
It is, and he loved to write to her when he was on campaign, and he hated to miss a post bag without a letter to her. There's a wonderful letter, isn't there, that he writes to her, and he hardly says anything in the letter. It's a tiny little letter, but it just says, kind of, the post was going, I didn't want to miss it without writing a line to you.
Yeah.
And that's just lovely. And also it chimes with what we know about Puritan attitudes to marriage at this time. Marriage was the central plank of a godly life and a happy and fulfilled life. So, the partnership and the companionship that Elizabeth gave to Oliver would have been fundamental to his emotional well-being, and mental well-being and everything.
Yes, I mean, they seem to have a fulfilled relationship. They seem to have, shall we say, children quite regularly, pretty much without toddler for about every 18 months until there's this period of hiatus since St Ives. Presumably, I mean, we know they lost one of their children, James, in infancy then, and also because of Oliver's depression, the financial circumstances, all of that going on, presumably, leads to an interruption in family life that then resumes when they move to Ely.
Well, I do find that really interesting. It feels a bit prurient to be digging into that, but the fact that they have 6 children, as you say, in such rapid succession, And then they lose a baby boy, James, just at the time that Oliver's having this, terrible downturn in financial status and also his kind of religious awakening and depression. And Elizabeth doesn't conceive any more children for 5 years. And, you put two and two together, you can assume perhaps that, life was a bit tricky for them. And, it wasn't particularly a romantic time. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that as soon as the fortunes turn around, when Oliver receives his inheritance, which enables him to move to Ely, very quickly they conceive their two final children, a pair of daughters, Mary and Frances, in very quick succession. So I think that tells us a lot about, that this really was a close and loving relationship where the ups and downs of these two individuals, fed into their very life together and their marital life together.
It's also quite interesting to think that we were discussing, if we started filming this, about sort of, there is an afterlife as well. I mean, the last few years of Elizabeth's life must have been really hard for her, and you've written about this recently. She goes through these series of shocks. First, her daughter, one of her daughters dies, Elizabeth, who will come to in a few moments, and then Oliver himself, and then the fall of Richard, and then the Restoration, and then Oliver's head being dug up, and then Bridget, the oldest daughter, dies. Yes. I mean, that's a really awful few years for anybody.
Oh God, it's a grim period, and she's accused of stealing from royal jewels and things when she leaves the palace and has to petition Charles II to say that she didn't. It would have been a really distressing final period of her life, which is sad. She does live with her son-in-law, John Claypole, at Northborough, not too far from here, and together they look after and raise Betty and John's children, because Betty has sadly died. And at least I think that, is quite a fitting, romantic and kind of maternal final chapter of her life, where probably she was back to what she knew and did best, running a household, looking after children, what an extraordinary life, what a life's journey to go on.
And even then the Royalists still have the opportunity to have a big actor, because then they published this, what I've often described as probably the strangest cookery book ever written, The Court and Kitchen of Elizabeth Cromwell, which we have an original copy on display in the museum. Which is basically a piece of political propaganda as what probably is at least some of Elizabeth's recipes inside there.
It is, and there's actually, it's an enormous example of snobbery, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a real sense throughout the time that the Cromwells are effectively the ruling house, living in the royal palaces. There's a real sort of snobbery and unkindness about them, and the way that they are lampooned and criticised by their opponents is very much to highlight their humble origins, to have digs at where they come from, that they come from trade, that Oliver's family brewed beer, or and all these horrible jibes. They call her Protectress Joan, because Joan was a name which was given to sort of women of
ladies of negotiable virtue.
But she definitely was not. And they accuse her of things like carrying on her country housewife pursuits, but in royal surroundings. They say that she's keeping cows in St James's Park and churning her own butter and all this kind of thing. And it's just very unkind, really. And I think it does a disservice to a lady actually who clearly was capable of rising to the occasion and hosting these incredible elaborate events at court, and doing it, as we were saying earlier, she didn't really put a foot wrong. She never embarrassed her husband. Actually, she never did anything wrong, really. So big fans of her. Big fans here.
Remarkable lady, and again, painting by Robert Walker. So we talked in our first programme about Cromwell's paintings. Of course, Robert Walker is effectively, although not possibly the first rank of artists from this period, certainly one of the best of the second rank of artists at this time, and very much the kind of parliamentarian kind of court painter. So obviously we know that he does a number of pictures of Cromwell, which obviously we've got two of them here in the museum's collections, but he paints Sir Thomas Fairfax, he paints various other people from the kind of Cromwellian court. So this one here has been again attributed to being one of Walker's works, and I think a little bit softer, I think, because of its subject matter than some of the other ones, but remarkable nonetheless. Okay, so we'll move on now to talk a little bit about some of Cromwell's children. He has 5 sons. one who dies in infancy, two who die quite young, obviously Richard and Henry, who we might talk about on another occasion. But we're here to talk about the Cromwell daughters now, and there are 4 daughters. Unfortunately, the oldest of them, and the one who you've just written about in The Rebel Daughter, Bridget, we don't actually have a painting of. Portraits of Bridget are actually the hardest to find, actually. There's only a couple of them around. She's a really interesting character. I mean, she seems to be, you know, when we talked about it before, I've described her as the Bolshevik.
Yes, that's how I like to see her. I've written recently about her and her sisters, and I kind of like to imagine her as almost the older Dashwood sister, maybe, a kind of Eleanor to Betty's Marianne, or the sisters from The Taming of the Shrew. She had a reputation at the time for being really very godly, and for that she was admired by various people like Lucy Hutchinson, who accused the other Cromwell siblings of being a bit flighty and vain and cavalierish. But Bridget she had time for. And I wonder, just with you saying that we don't have as many portraits of her, maybe that's to do with the lifestyle that she was leading, because she married first Henry Ireton and then after his death Charles Fleetwood, both of whom were key leaders in the army and key figures in Henry Ireton's case in the sort of move to revolution in Pride's Purge and the King's Trial and Execution. And both, interestingly, in turn, govern Ireland. And she goes over there as the wife of the ruler of Ireland, effectively, but with 2 different husbands, which is really intriguing. But yes, she keeps herself very much with the army. And she's the only one of the daughters during the Protectorate who isn't living within the royal palaces. She's just down the road at Wallingford House with Charles Fleetwood. Also in Whitehall, but not cheek by jowl with Mr. and Mrs. Cromwell, as the other 3 are, who are living and enjoying court life and all the court trappings of that, and the fashions and the fun. Bridget remains a bit at arm's length, a bit aloof, a bit godly, very much on the side of the army in the tensions that arise during the Protectorate over the direction of travel, whether it's going to become a monarchical and softer and more civilian regime, or whether it should return to slightly more republican and militaristic character. So maybe that explains it.
Yes, she seems to be sort of more, politically switched on than some of the others do as well. Sort of obviously, particularly with those relationships with her 2 husbands as well. Well,
I think so, and it's interesting to remember. I mean, we just talked about the Miss Elizabeth Cromwell and her pattern of conception of these children, but it's actually a really important point that the 2 older daughters, Bridget and Elizabeth, or Betty as she's known, are actually adults during the Civil War. They live through it themselves. They get married during it. And Bridget actually goes on campaign with the army. And she's really in this tight social circle with General Fairfax and his wife, Anne Fairfax, and the other army leaders' wives. So she's there, living through the war, supporting the army. And actually Oliver Cromwell writes to her while she's away with the army on campaign. He writes to her instead of to Henry Ireton, to her husband. He says in this wonderful letter, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, I'm writing to you because if I write to him, he'll stay up too late and overwork himself to reply to me.
So, trying to get a bit of work-life balance going on in the Ireton house.
So I'm going to make use of this very useful channel, namely that me, Oliver Cromwell, my daughter Bridget, is married to my second-in-command on Henry. I'm going to use her as a back channel. But, so she's right at the heart of the action there, which is what I try and capture in my novel, The Rebel Daughter. Whereas the younger 2, who we'll come on to talk about, were children during the Civil War. Were very young children and came of age while their father was head of state as Lord Protector. So their experience of his rise is very, very different.
And sort of Bridget and Charles Fleetwood's experience after the Restoration, I mean, they're still kicking around in London, but they're regarded, I think, with a certain degree of suspicion, aren't they, still?
Oh, I think so. They're kind of beyond the pale. I don't think they can be revived or hold any kind of public...
Okay, so they've kind of been cancelled, I suppose is the modern equivalent.
This is a fantastic period for cancel culture, if you want to study it, because... Oliver being the whole interregnum period being cancelled at the Restoration is the ultimate example of cancel culture. But yes, Bridget and Charles Fleetwood are sort of persona non grata, really. Whereas some of the younger children, who we'll talk about next, actually have quite successful lives during the Restoration.
Okay, so let's move on to talk about Cromwell's second daughter, well, according to many traditions, his favourite, Betty, whose portrait we can see just here. And of course, there is this whole thing about pet names within the family, isn't there?
There is, and I think it's something that's really appealing about the Cromwell family at so many centuries distance, is that they're a very intimate family. They use nicknames. All of them have nicknames. Dick, Harry, Biddy, Betty, Mal, Fanny, they've all got nicknames, and they all use them in their correspondence. And I think it's a wonderful example and of the fact that this was an ordinary family who were raised and lived throughout their childhoods as an ordinary family living under one roof. They're not a royal family. And if you think about most ruling families, royal families, their childhoods are very different. Often the children of Henry VIII were growing up in separate households. So this intimacy and the nicknames they use for each other, I think, is a wonderful way to just capture the uniqueness of their time as the ruling family.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this particular painting is quite interesting. It's probably painted by the circle of Peter Lely, so maybe by Lely himself, maybe by one of his students. Lely, of course, who's still very much learning his trade in the 1650s and just becoming up to the kind of the great artist of the Restoration period that we all know. And of course, famously in the 1650s, he's alleged to have painted Cromwell, and that discussion we again had in our last episode. It's again a kind of slightly informal view that we've got in this painting, this lovely blue dress just here with her ringlets and so on. Again, she almost looks kind of quite, for want of a better description, cavalier-like in it.
She does, and you mentioned the Restoration beauties. I always say about these pictures of the Cromwell women, daughters when they're younger, during the Protectorate, and there are other portraits of Mary and Frances when they're younger in similarly elaborate and beautiful costumes, that they wouldn't look out of place in the gallery of Restoration beauties with Charles II's mistresses. And again, we come back to banging our drum about the point that these are not Puritans, drab door Puritans. These are very beautifully dressed and feminine ladies. I mean, look at that was a very fashionable style of dress, I understand, in the 1650s, which set fashions which continued into the 60s, with the dress sort of low on the shoulders and very loose and a deep neckline and these ringlets. And look at that, and there's lovely pearls over her sleeve. I mean, it's very romantic, sort of wistful and romantic.
She's one who's also been regarded, I think, as the kind of acceptable face of the Cromwell family by some royalists, isn't she? So there's a whole series of stories about, she pleads for royalists on her father, to her father, and all sorts of things out of this. How much credence should we give to those sorts of stories?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? They're clearly working on the fact that she and her father were undoubtedly very, very close and very devoted. And her death, premature death, probably of cancer, in 1658, only a month before Oliver's own, is thought to have hastened his own end. And in a sense, her early death contributes to the sort of mythology of her as this beautiful sort of kind and generous Arthurian princess. And her body is floated from Hampton Court up to Whitehall in this amazing dusk in the evening flotilla, torch-lit flotilla down the Thames. It is very, very tragic, very Arthurian. And she was buried in Westminster Abbey, and she is the only Cromwell who still is there under the flagstones in Westminster Abbey. I mean, what a coup. So she, Betty Claypole, who was the local beauty of the town of Ely, is lying in state under the Chapel of Kings in Westminster Abbey with Elizabeth I and all these other amazing monarchs. So yes, I think that persona is slightly sort of built around her, but she was at the centre of her father's court. She's married to John Claypole, who is Oliver Cromwell's Master of Horse, which is a very ceremonial and sort of front and centre role at the Protectorate in any royal court.
And very much a statement for a man who loved horses, of course.
Absolutely, and they shared that passion together. And they have these children, and Oliver takes her children into Council of State meetings and has them on his knee. So, really, she is the golden girl at the centre of the Protectoral court.
Fascinating character, and as you say, his premature death, left him absolutely grief-stricken, and led to a very hasty decline from that and ill health shortly thereafter. So here we have, these are later 1700 paintings. We do have other paintings of these two in our collection, but they can't be 100% categorically identified as being these two. There's been some debate amongst some art historians, which is why we use these two on display here, because these are categorically the two youngest Cromwell daughters, Mary and Frances. Both painted a little later, so you'll notice that the dresses here are very much late 17th, very early 18th century. These two, of course, who had quite long lives, you know, long after the Restoration and so on, because, of course, also quite relaxed lives, because, of course, they'd married very well.
Well, yes, and again, it comes back to the point about the contrast in the experiences of these two pairs of daughters, because Bridget and Betty are both dead by, within a couple of years of the Restoration, whereas Mary and Frances, they are younger. They live right through into the next century. They see off the Stuarts, as I like to say. I think that's really fun. And Mary is talked of in the later Stuart courts as being a real sort of relic and a curiosity, because she looks very like her father and people peer at her. And she marries Viscount Fauconberg, who's from a distinguished Yorkshire royalist family, and Frances marries Robert Rich and later John Russell. And again, these weddings take place at the height of Oliver Cromwell's power as Lord Protector in 1657, and they are very, very lavish weddings in the royal palaces, attended by all the dignitaries of the land, foreign ambassadors, etc., with feasting, dancing, and new masks are performed, both composed and performed. So, and it's quite a coup, really, for the Cromwell family to arrange marriages for these daughters into established royal and noble families of England. So their marriages are part of the drive in the last few years of the Protectorate to really expand the base of support for the Protectorate and really heal and settle old wounds. There's quite a lot of intermarriage between former royalists and parliamentarian families around this time. And they are being cultivated as the next dynasty, the next ruling house. Before Oliver dies, it's all to play for, and we think this is the new ruling house.
I mean, this is the question, isn't it? And this is the bits that all historians kind of they'll get into a historical bun fight at this point with umpteen different opinions. But the question about is this sort of the Cromwell family feathering their nests? Mm-hmm. Is this a sort of dynastic relationship, and people are keen to marry them because they're saying what might be potentially the next royal house? Mm-hmm. If Cromwell is offered the crown again, will he accept or will he not? Or is this effectively Oliver Cromwell king in all but name?
There's so much interesting work going on that right now, actually, and Patrick Little's doing some work on the marriage negotiations and marriage settlements. And I mean, there is a sense that this criticism that they're feathering their nests, it's really hard to substantiate that, actually, when you look at the accounts and the marriages. Cromwell really isn't in the business of building up huge estates for himself and building up huge pots of money and sort of selling off his daughters to the highest bidder. He and Elizabeth, his wife, take Puritan marriage very, very seriously. And for all of their children, they help to arrange marriages for them, where there is going to be at least some affection, some liking between the couple. And they prioritise that over just trying to enhance their own family status. So, I think Oliver does pretty well by both these girls. And Frances, actually, the heroine of my first novel, The Puritan Princess, does actually marry for love, very passionate love, and is allowed to do so to Robert Rich, who's a courtier in Cromwell's court. So, it's a very exciting time for these women in the 1650s.
Yeah, so the one below by John Riley, the first book by Thomas Murray. Both kind of, as I say, late sort of 1600s artworks, and again showing quite extravagant dress, but of course this is reflecting the sort of late 17th century court.
Yes, and by this stage, I mean, Frances, for instance, is a widow, and much later on in her life, so that's why she looks a bit sort of dour. But if you look, there's another painting of a young Frances Cromwell in the Kelvin Grove art gallery. Which is enormously beautiful and
flowing dresses,
satin, ringlets, pearls, where she looks just like you know, this dreamy princess. So, you know, don't be fooled by the slightly matronly appearance of these two. They had very glamorous and luxurious and long lives.
Miranda, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for giving your time up and coming to see us today and sharing your wealth of expertise and insights into these remarkable characters. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for having me, Stuart. It's wonderful to be able to talk about these women.
It is, and they are a remarkable collection. Obviously, the problem is that quite often the way history has been written about this period, very male-dominated, sort of focusing on sort of, you know, Cromwell and his achievements, understandably, but sometimes these women have been sort of missed out and overshadowed, and now they're starting to emerge from those shadows. So long may that continue. Hope you've enjoyed that. Hope you found that interesting. If you're joining us for the live version of this, please do stick around for a little bit of question and answer and any discussion, anything you would like to know. If you're looking at the recorded version on YouTube, then don't forget to like and subscribe. And thank you very much for joining us today. As I say, apologies for some of the sound problems we had on the beginnings of that. It was very much recorded in haste on Friday afternoon. We had literally about an hour to do the whole of that. And as I say, so the museum is not the most ideal space in terms of sound because it's a large echoey building. But hopefully you've got the sort of the gist of that, and we'll try and add subtitles as well for the YouTube version. So, Miranda, I don't know whether you want to unmute as well, and we'll try and pick out some questions I know already people have been putting into the chat, and we'll sort of try and we'll just remove the transcription at this point, and we'll basically try and answer any questions. So, right, okay, here we go. So, various bits and pieces that people have asked here. Did Cromwell's mother accompany him whether he was engaged in his military campaigns and his atrocities in Ireland? It's one of the questions here, obviously, with him being in different households and so on. Do you want to pick that one up, or shall I?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We don't think that Cromwell's mother went anywhere with him. She very much stayed put with the family back at home. Cromwell's wife Elizabeth didn't go on campaign with him either, as some army wives did. So Sir Thomas Fairfax's wife Anne goes with him, and we think that Francis, John Lambert's wife, goes, as does Bridget Ireton, not necessarily to Ireland, but certainly around the UK. There was a question at one point when Oliver was in Ireland, I think Stuart in 49, when it looked for a while as if his wife Elizabeth was going to go over there to be with him. And I think she actually travels across England, doesn't she? She travels to the coast and then for some reason doesn't set sail, and she just goes home again. So I'm not quite sure about that. But yes, in general, he was there without his relations, and I think very much missing them, sending lots of letters home.
Okay. Comment from Julian here. Understated wealth and power in dress is very English. Contrast the clothes with Louis XIV's Versailles. Yeah, very good point. Very much so. Question from Dave.
I think, just to jump in there, Stuart, I think also is a good point, and I think that's quite, you can take that to be quite representative of the kind of culture at Cromwell's court, where it wasn't the sort of dour and Puritan court that we might imagine, where all fun was banned and everyone was dressed in a very grey and dour way. It is very fashionable and very lively, and there are lots of arts and exciting things happening, hunting, hawking, feasting, etc. But everything is done in moderation. There's sort of, people play cards, but there's no extreme gambling. There's romance, but there are none of the shocking exploits which we then become familiar with under Charles II at his court. So yes, I think of the Protectorate court really as sort of sitting somewhere in between the court of Charles I, which is very, very formal and traditional, and the court of Charles II, which is basically one big party, and Cromwell's court somewhere in the middle.
Question from Dave Kellett here. Cromwell's mother's head is covered, but some of the younger Cromwells are bareheaded. Did this attract criticism from stricter Puritans, or was it a case as if you were rich, you could dress how you liked? Is this a fashion thing, or what do we reckon out of this?
I think that's a very good question. I think again, it's partly to do with sort of a domestic setting or being out and about. I think there was a sense that once a woman married, and then when she was, in and about her house, she would have had probably some sort of cap, and that went on for centuries, really, that idea of having a mob cap or something in the house. But out and about, they didn't really wear hats necessarily in the same way. And certainly with the daughters, once they're being painted, they really are quite beautiful and grand ladies, and therefore they wouldn't have a cap kind of like that. So, but again, it all comes back to our perceptions, doesn't it, of Puritanism. As one historian put it very well, Puritanism is in the eye of the beholder, which I thought was very good. There isn't one type of Puritan, and actually Cromwell and his family are not the most extreme Puritans or that we might imagine them to be, actually. And especially when a generation down, his sons and daughters, especially all of those apart from Bridget, are really quite middle of the road in terms of their faith and their tastes in terms of fashion. Yeah, very good question.
Yeah, we tend to see Puritanism in the popular imagination seen as a kind of homogenous group, whereas actually it's a sort of broad range of people with lots of different viewpoints with a sort of broad area. A bit like sort of, in that sense, a political party today, you get lots of people with different opinions within sort of a kind of broad amount, as it were, or broad area.
Exactly, and it's very worth emphasizing that, because this helps Oliver and the Cromwell family to escape some of the kind of, or at least should help them to escape many of the criticisms leveled at them by particularly people subsequently, who just look at what they look like, or the fact they're living in the royal palaces, or the kind of lives they're having, and think that makes them hypocrites because they're not living as sort of monkish Puritans. But there was absolutely no hypocrisy to this. The kind of life that Cromwell and his wife and his children live would have been absolutely understood at the time as being the life of a country gentleman with traditional gentlemanly like tastes, who was of a Puritan bent in terms of his personal religious belief. There's no hypocrisy there at all.
Question from Stephen here. Has the first portrait, possibly Elizabeth I, been x-rayed? The large areas do look as though there may have been an identification there, perhaps painted over when Oliver was out of fashion. Just a thought. I can answer that one, Stephen. The short answer is we've only just got it, and it's just come back from the conservator. Yes, there are large areas on there, and in fact there's an area on the painting that a couple of us have looked at so far where it looks like there may be an identification that has been painted over. In terms of x-raying with our limited budget, possibly not. I'd love to. I mean, that would depend on the owner. It's on long-term loan to us from a private collector. A gentleman who bought it in 1992 at auction. It was there's a whole story behind this in terms of how it was discovered, and it's been in an attic in St Albans for about the last 5 years. It is possible. And the problem with all of these identifications you see in a lot of portraits of this period is actually they're not necessarily painted, those aren't even painted on at the time, which means that there's also lots of misidentifications, because quite a lot of them are actually painted on later in, say, the late 17th or even into the 18th century. So there's a whole thing around that. But yes, it's a good suggestion. That might well be the case. The short answer is that I think there will be a lot of research and investigations that go onwards with regard to that, and we'll keep you posted as we go along. It's going to be a bit of a long road, this one, but it's certainly one of the most interesting portraits, or certainly the interesting candidates for being a painting of Cromwell's mother that we've seen.
and it has a better provenance than both, because we know that as far back as 1784 it was exhibited at Hinchinbrook House, owned by the Montagues, and the Earls of Sandwich, who of course were close associates of the Cromwell family. Hinchinbrook, which was actually owned by the Cromwells. So it's a much earlier identification as being Cromwell's mother than many other paintings. So it looks promising, but obviously we don't say definite at the moment. And even with many paintings that are definitely identified as a specific person, those don't always necessarily kind of come out accordingly. Question from Alison: what is the title of your book on Bridget?
Oh, thanks. Well, conveniently and not at all coincidentally, I have it here behind me. It's The Rebel Daughter. This is the one about Bridget, and this is The Puritan Princess, which is about Francis. So do all rush out and get your copies, and I hope you enjoy them.
Okay, thank you. Question here from Naomi, again asking about Ireland. Is anything known about Cromwell's family's views on his atrocities, for their ignorance of them? In Ireland, Cromwell is more vilified than Hitler. I think there's sort of, I mean, the attitudes in England in the 17th century to what was happening in Ireland would be very different to those today. And people would be, you know, probably thinking, unfortunately, that most of what was going on was quite acceptable. I don't know if you want to add into that, Miranda, or anything else, further thoughts?
Well, no, I mean, I think we don't know specifically. We don't have any kind of correspondence or anything from them about that. But as Stuart says, the broad view at the time would have been that, you know, what Cromwell was doing, unfortunately, was sort of within the rules of law of war at the time, and did contribute in large part to the conquest being very quick, and all the, you know, many of the other towns that he approached surrendering without any loss of life. We do also know that actually there wasn't, the reports, the kind of press didn't really get there to see what was happening in Ireland. So actually there weren't a lot of accounts coming back to England from Ireland while the conquest was happening. So it was very hard to get exact news or about, you know, the sieges themselves back in London, for instance, until later on. So, you know, we don't really know particularly in that sense, I'm afraid.
Yeah, there's very little published that sort of really kind of goes into this in terms of the portraying this in a negative light until really the end of the 19th century. You could argue, unfortunately, largely because the British establishment was carrying on doing equally unpleasant things to Ireland, and again considered them to be perfectly acceptable even until then. So it's really only the late 19th century there's an identification of what Cromwell did as being some form of atrocity, basically with the rise of the Irish nationalist movement in the late 19th century. So unfortunately that's sort of the way sort of history has changed. Yeah, in terms of things like, yeah, well, Bloody Sunday's obviously more recent times, but yes, there's sort of it's only really the sort of the recognition of Britain's role in Ireland, and the negative aspects of that is only something over the last 100 years that's gradually become recognised, and it's still something which is a cause of, unfortunately, tensions even today.
There's a question before that, Stuart, about the daily routines of Cromwell's family.
Yes, so very question from John Gillibrand. Hi, John. How much do we know about the daily routines of Cromwell's family? Do we know if there were any similarities and differences to the functioning of contemporary European courts?
Well, we don't know as much about their day-to-day kind of routines once they're in power in the 1650s as we would have done of other royal courts, but we know a lot. I mean, we have inventories about all their possessions and how all their rooms were furnished, for instance, which gives us a good idea of what kind of style they're living in. We have the accounts of various ambassadors who were at the court at the time, as well as lots of correspondence from people in and out of the court. We also have the court newspaper, which is reporting on all of their activities. You know, and this again is the first age of journalism. I mean, this is where newspapers start in British history, is in this period, covering the events of the court. So we do know kind of how they were living. We know which rooms they were living in. We know, for instance, that at big occasions, state occasions and feasts, Mrs. Cromwell, Elizabeth Cromwell, would be hosting her own table and hosting dignitaries at her own table, and Oliver would be hosting at another table. We know that they had big events in the banqueting house, which you can still go and visit, the reception of foreign ambassadors, for instance, and the masques, which were brought back during the 1650s, which we associate very much with Stuart courts, were performed there. There was a lot of music happening. Oliver Cromwell's a huge music fan, as long as it's not in church where it distracts from preaching. But he has an organ brought from Magdalen College, Oxford, which he installs in Hampton Court. And he and his wife play duets, they take piano lessons, and his daughters Mary and Frances have singing lessons. He employs court musicians and court composers and court poets. So, you know, this is really quite a lovely and cultured court. In terms of the routines, we do know that the Cromwell family used to spend Monday to Friday at Whitehall Palace, and then would travel out to Hampton Court for Saturdays and Sundays. And they have been credited actually as inventing the weekend, which I rather like, which is quite fun in doing that. And they would have travelled to and from Hampton Court by road in the royal coach. There was a state coach, protectoral coach, and also on the river they'd have travelled by barge. And the protector had his own liveried, you know, bargemen, watermen, soldiers. There was a lifeguard, just like the king would have had, that went everywhere with him and with the family. And you know, they lived in their own sort of bedrooms and apartments that were very close to each other, but also there were kind of the usual trappings. There was a kind of inner presence chamber, outer presence chamber. People would wait for audiences with them, with Oliver, obviously. But the daughters and wife and sons are very much involved in Cromwell's daily life. We have a report, for instance, from a foreign ambassador of the fact that when he left London to return back to his native country, he made sure that he went to Hampton Court and took his leave of Cromwell's wife and daughters, and enjoyed a glass of wine and a bit of hunting or whatever with them. So, you know, that gives you a bit of an idea of the kind of way they're living.
You know, if the sort of you know, Cromwell obviously is definitely doing the sort of, you know, the weekdays in Whitehall and the weekend at Hampton Court. Are the rest of the family more at Hampton Court, or are they moving around with him? Are they doing as much shuttling around as he is?
Yeah, I think they're probably doing a fair bit of shuttling. I mean, they certainly have their own apartments in both palaces. And you know, that they would have been, he would have required them to be present at a lot of the state functions, which always happen at Whitehall Palace. So, I mean, there's periods of their life probably where there may be fewer public events happening. And for instance, for Betty, when she is towards the end of her life, when she is very ill and convalescing, she goes out to stay more permanently at Hampton Court. So they wouldn't have been together all the time, but there would have been a fair amount of moving to and fro, I think.
Thank you for the fingers crossed from Stephen, by the way. Yes, we're fingers crossed on the painting as well, but I suspect it'll be a few months before we know as well with that one.